The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. A soldier was dying in the middle of Riverside Valley Medical Center's trauma bay, and the most decorated combat medic in the room was holding a mop. That was the moment everything cracked open. The lies, the humiliation, the weeks of being handed cleaning supplies and called sweetheart by men who never once looked at her face. Abigail Foster had survived 4 combat deployments, 2 helicopter crashes, and a classified extraction mission that rewrote Air Force rescue protocol. She had come home, put on scrubs, and quietly disappeared into the background of a hospital that treated her like furniture. And then the trucks arrived. And then a commander saw her face. And then 30 soldiers went silent in a hallway. Because the woman they had all been stepping around was someone every one of them owed their life to. If this story already has you hooked, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this goes. Like, follow, and stay with me until the very end. Because what happens next changes everything. The shift started at 6 in the morning, the way every shift started, with Abigail Foster walking through the staff entrance carrying a thermos of bad coffee and a duffel bag nobody ever looked twice at. Riverside Valley Medical Center sat at the eastern edge of Ashford, Colorado, pressed against the foothills with the Rockies rising gray and indifferent behind it. It was a mid-sized regional hospital, busy enough to feel important, but not large enough to have the kind of oversight that caught things before they went wrong. The ER handled everything from ski injuries to ranch accidents, and the medical staff had long developed the particular brand of arrogance that comes from being the only real trauma center for 60 miles in any direction. Abigail had been working there for 11 weeks. She was 30 years old, 5'6", with close-cropped brown hair she never bothered styling, and a face that had learned, years ago, to show very little. She moved through the hospital's corridors with an efficiency that people sometimes noticed and immediately forgot about, the way you notice a door closing and then stop thinking about it. She did not charm people. She did not seek attention. She showed up, she worked, she went home. This was, she understood, exactly the problem. Foster. Dr. Garrett Winslow didn't look up from the chart he was scanning when she walked through the trauma bay. He was the chief physician, 53, silver-haired, with the kind of institutional authority that had never once been seriously challenged. He had a habit of addressing the nursing staff by last name only, a habit that managed to feel both impersonal and condescending at the same time. The supply closet on the second floor is a disaster. Someone needs to reorganize it before rounds. Abigail stopped. Dr. Winslow, I'm scheduled for triage coverage this morning. We've got 2 open shifts on the floor, and I didn't ask for your schedule, Foster. He finally looked at her, briefly, the way you'd look at a clock on the wall. The closet. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Yes, doctor," and turned away. This was also, she understood, a pattern. The supply closet was on the second floor, between the physical therapy suite and a cluster of administrative offices nobody seemed to use. It was genuinely a mess. Boxes stacked wrong, IV supplies shoved onto shelves, designed for wound care materials. The kind of organizational collapse that happened when a department was understaffed and everyone had quietly agreed to pretend the problem didn't exist. Abigail worked through it methodically, moving boxes, relabeling shelves, doing the actual inventory in her head because the written one hadn't been updated in 3 months. She heard footsteps stop in the doorway. "You reorganizing the whole floor?" Nurse coordinator Dana Pritch leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Dana was 45 and had run the second floor's nursing staff with a combination of genuine competence and casual exclusion that Abigail had come to recognize as its own kind of power. She didn't dislike Abigail. She simply didn't include her, which amounted to the same thing. "Winslow put you on closet duty again? He needs it done before rounds." "He does that." Dana said it without apology, without acknowledgement that it was strange or unfair, just a fact. Water is wet. The chief reassigns nurses to storage tasks. "Listen, we've got a patient in 204 who's been asking for someone to explain his post-op instructions again. Apparently Dr. Farouk went through them too fast. Can you handle it after you're done here?" "Sure." Dana left. Abigail went back to the boxes. She didn't tell Dana that she had spent 14 months as a flight medic with the Air Force's 38th Rescue Squadron, that she had performed surgical interventions at altitude in conditions that would make most ER physicians physically ill, that she had a combat medical certification that took 18 months to earn and had never once been asked about in the 11 weeks since she submitted her application to this hospital. She didn't say any of it. There was no version of that conversation that ended well. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The patient in 204 was a rancher named Gil Haskell, 61, recovering from a knee replacement with the particular grumpiness of a man who had never once voluntarily sat still. He had the post-op instructions on a paper he'd clearly folded and unfolded several times already. "This doesn't make sense," he said, pointing at a line about anticoagulants. "Which part?" "All of it." He squinted at her badge. "You a real nurse, or are you here to change my sheets?" "I'm a real nurse, Mr. Haskell." "Because the last one who came in looked about 19. "What specifically doesn't make sense about the anticoagulant instructions?" He told her. She explained it. Twice. Because the first time he interrupted with a question that was actually good. It concerned a potential interaction with a blood pressure medication he'd been taking for 6 years that wasn't listed anywhere in his chart. Abigail went still for a moment, then asked him to confirm the exact dosage. He told her. She did the calculation in her head, cross-referenced it against what she knew about his procedure, and went to find Dr. Farouk before Gil Haskell even finished his sentence about how nobody around here ever listened to him. Doctor. Farouk was 28, a second-year resident who was either exhausted or naturally skeptical. Abigail had never been able to tell which. He looked at the medication she flagged and started to say something dismissive before he actually thought it through. Then his expression changed. That's a real interaction. He was already pulling up the chart. How did you catch that? He mentioned it. I ran the numbers. Farouk looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded and turned back to the chart, and Abigail went back to the supply closet because there were still 3 boxes left. This was the thing that nobody here understood about her. She didn't need recognition. Recognition was noise. What she needed was for the work to be done correctly, for the patients to be safe, for the gaps to be filled before someone fell through them. She had learned to operate this way in environments where a wrong decision meant a body bag. The stakes at Riverside Valley were different, mostly, but the framework held. You did the work, you stayed quiet, you kept your eyes open. She had been keeping her eyes open for 11 weeks, and what she saw worried her more than she let on. Winslow ran the ER with a confidence that had long since stopped being questioned, which meant it had also stopped being calibrated. He made good decisions most of the time, which was just often enough to obscure the times he didn't. 3 days ago, Abigail had watched him dismiss a triage note about a 44-year-old woman's chest pressure because the EKG looked borderline clean, and then spend 20 minutes explaining to a medical student why his initial instinct was always reliable. The woman had been admitted 4 hours later with a confirmed STEMI. Winslow had walked past Abigail in the hallway afterward and said, "These things happen," and kept walking. She had written it in her notes. She had been writing things in her notes for 11 weeks. At 11:30, she was in the break room eating half a sandwich when Marcus Tillman sat down across from her. Marcus was one of the ER nurses, 26, with the kind of easy competence that hadn't yet been ground into something harder by the institution. He was one of the only people on staff who talked to Abigail like she was fully present in the room. "Winslow had you in the closet again," he said. It wasn't a question. Supply organization is legitimate work. For facilities staff, maybe. He opened a bag of chips with more force than necessary. "You know what he told Pritch this morning? He said he wasn't sure you were clinically engaging enough." His words. "He said that to Dana?" "Dana told me. I don't think she meant it as gossip, more like a warning." Marcus looked at her steadily. "You should push back, Abigail. You're better than half the staff here, and everyone can see it except the people who matter." "I've only been here 11 weeks. "Right. And in 11 weeks, you've caught 3 medication errors, identified 2 patients who needed higher-level care than they were getting, and reorganized every supply closet on the floor. That's not someone who isn't engaging. That's someone who doesn't make noise." He paused. "That's not the same thing." Abigail looked at her sandwich. "I know." "Then what are you waiting for?" She didn't answer that, because the honest answer was complicated. wound around things she didn't discuss, a history she had spent years carefully folding away into a part of herself that didn't surface unless she needed it. She wasn't hiding, exactly. She was protecting the distance between who she had been and who she was trying to be now. The Air Force had given her skills she used every day. It had also given her a level of loss she hadn't fully finished with yet, and the two things were so knotted together that she couldn't talk about one without the other coming loose. Marcus finished his chips. He stood up, crumpled the bag, made the shot into the trash from 7 feet away. I'm just saying, you keep letting them treat you like the help. Eventually, that's all they'll see. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong, but she also knew that she had survived things that made this look quiet. And sometimes quiet was what you needed to survive long enough to be useful. The afternoon brought 3 minor traumas in quick succession. A construction worker with a lacerated forearm, a teenager with a suspected concussion from a mountain bike fall, and a 68-year-old who had fainted at the grocery store and scared his wife badly enough that she'd called an ambulance rather than driving him herself. Abigail worked all 3, mostly in the background of the residents and attendings, watching, filling in, anticipating what would be needed before anyone asked for it. The teenager's concussion was worse than the initial assessment suggested. She flagged it. The attending on duty, a woman named Dr. Serena Mack, who was competent and perpetually overworked, paused and reevaluated and agreed and upgraded the kid's observation status. Doctor. Mack said, "Good catch," without looking up and moved to the next patient. Abigail charted it and kept moving. At 4:15 p.m., she was in the process of restocking the crash cart in Bay 3 when Dr. Winslow walked through with a cluster of medical students, 4 of them, early 20s, wearing the slightly stunned expression of people who were still calibrating the distance between textbook and actual human suffering. Winslow was in full lecture mode, which was when he was at his worst and also his most visible. Bay 3, he said, sweeping one hand toward the space where Abigail was working, is our primary resuscitation suite. Notice how it's set up. He stopped, looked at the crash cart, looked at Abigail. Is that being restocked right now? It was down to 60% on epinephrine. I can see that. His voice had the tone of someone explaining a mistake to someone who should have known better. The cart gets restocked at the start of each shift, not mid-afternoon. The morning check logged it as complete, but the count was off. I verified it manually. She didn't make it defensive, just stated it. Winslow looked at her the way he always looked at her, as if she were mildly inconvenient. These students don't need to see housekeeping tasks. Can you... He gestured, a small dismissive motion toward the door. One of the medical students, a young woman with dark eyes and a tight expression, glanced at Abigail and then quickly away. Abigail picked up the tray, moved out of the bay. She heard Winslow resume his lecture behind her. She did not listen to it. She took the tray to the supply room, finished the restock documentation, returned the crash cart to full operational status, and filed the discrepancy in her log under the section she'd started calling procedural drift. 43 entries now. 43 documented moments where something that should have been done correctly wasn't, where a protocol that existed on paper didn't exist in practice, where a patient's safety had rested on someone noticing something that the official checklist had missed. She closed the log and set it aside. Not time yet. At 5:47 p.m., the radio on the charge nurse's desk crackled with something that made every conversation in the ER stop simultaneously. Not the words. They came in fragmented, partially overrun by static, and the specific urgency that emergency frequencies develop when something has gone badly wrong. But the frequency itself. Military. That was what Abigail heard first, before her brain had processed the content. She recognized the protocol cadence the way you recognize an accent from home. Marcus was closest to the desk. He looked at the charge nurse, an older woman named Roz, who had been doing this for 22 years, and whose face, in that moment, went the particular shade of controlled alarm that 22 years had taught her to wear. "What is that?" Marcus said. Roz said, "Fort Callum." That was 40 minutes north. Special Operations Training Installation, officially listed as a joint training facility with a name that most Ashford residents didn't think about very often. Abigail had been thinking about it for 11 weeks, specifically about its proximity, specifically about the fact that Riverside Valley was the designated trauma facility for its personnel, specifically about the gap between what the ER's current trauma team could handle and what a Fort Callum casualty might actually require. She was already untying her isolation gown. "Foster," Winslow's voice, sharp, from the nurse's station. "What are you doing?" "Getting ready." "Getting ready for what exactly?" "We don't have confirmed information yet." "That's military medevac protocol on Channel 7, she said, not stopping. "They're calling for trauma bay clearance and advance notice. That means they have a critical casualty and they're 4 to 8 minutes out." Winslow stared at her. "How do you know what Channel 7? The ambulance bay doors burst open. Not paramedics, not an ambulance. 2 military vehicles, a modified transport van and a dark SUV with government plates, swinging wide into the receiving area with the kind of organized urgency that had its own specific grammar. The side door of the transport opened before it fully stopped, and 3 men in tactical clothing, not uniforms, not exactly, but the equipment was unmistakable, jumped out. 2 of them were supporting a third between them, and the third man was not moving correctly. His head was down. His right arm hung at an angle that made something in Abigail's chest go cold. Behind the transport, a second vehicle stopped hard, and a man climbed out who was not in tactical clothing but who moved like someone who had worn it for 30 years. Tall, late 40s, with a face that had been weathered by altitudes and decisions that didn't have good options. He was scanning the bay with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing an LZ. Winslow was already moving forward, taking on the visible authority of a chief physician receiving a patient, which was what the situation called for and what he knew how to perform. "What do we have?" he called out. One of the tactical men answered without breaking stride. "Blast injury, primary thoracic involvement, possible pneumothorax. BP's been dropping for 30 minutes. We've got 2 large bore IVs, but he's—" "Get him into Bay 1, Winslow said, already turning. "I need respiratory on this immediately, and someone get me a chest X-ray set up." The man from the second vehicle, the one who moved like someone who had worn tactical clothing for 30 years, had stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the ambulance bay. He was looking at Abigail. She had her back to him. She was pulling a trauma kit from the wall mount near the bay entrance, running through its contents by touch, the way you did when you'd done it enough times that your hands knew the inventory before your eyes did. She hadn't looked at the vehicles. She was looking at the contents of the kit. "Falcon." She went still. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a question. It was the specific way someone says a word they have not said in a very long time, when they weren't entirely sure they'd be saying it to the right person, when the word itself carries weight that has nothing to do with its syllables. She turned. The man standing in the bay was Colonel Aaron Voss, and the last time she had seen him, she had been airlifting him out of a mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan with 2 broken ribs and a bullet in his left shoulder, and he had called her Falcon then too. The call sign she'd earned in her first tour when she'd descended on a static line into a firefight to reach a downed pilot and had come back up with the pilot and a story that became something people told in hushed voices at installations she'd never been posted to. Colonel Voss was looking at her like he was seeing a ghost. The tactical team was moving their soldier into Bay 1. Winslow was directing. Marcus was pulling equipment. The whole ER was in the controlled chaos of a major trauma arrival. Everyone focused forward, everyone moving, except Voss and Abigail. "Sir," she said. Her voice was steady. "They told me you left." His voice was careful, like he was handling something fragile. "We looked for you. After everything. We looked. I needed to step back. You're—" He looked at her scrubs, at the hospital badge clipped to her chest, at the supply kit in her hands. "You're a nurse here." "Yes, sir." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for. Then behind him, from Bay 1, she heard something that made her stop thinking about Aaron Voss entirely. The sound was specific, a change in the monitor tone, not an alarm but a precursor to one. The kind of shift in rhythm that meant the patient's condition was about to deteriorate faster than whatever was being done to him. She heard it because she'd heard it before, in worse places than this, and her body responded before her brain caught up. She was moving toward Bay 1 when she heard Winslow's voice inside. I'm not seeing attention pneumo on this initial assessment. Let's get the film first before we... She pushed through the door. The soldier on the table was young. She registered that first, young and pale and working too hard to breathe, his chest moving with a specific asymmetry that was a signature if you knew what you were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. She'd known it from the doorway. Dr. Winslow. Her voice was quiet. It's a tension pneumothorax. Winslow turned. His expression when he saw her cross the threshold of the trauma bay, his trauma bay, was a specific combination of surprise and displeasure she'd seen on his face before, just never this intensely. Foster. This is a restricted... His trachea is deviated. Left side, look at the left side. His breath sounds are absent on the right. She was already beside the table, gloves on, 2 seconds from the glove box on the wall. If you wait for the film, you will not have a patient to film. Every person in the room went still. Winslow looked at the patient, looked at his chest. His eyes moved with the reluctant precision of someone who didn't want to see something but was seeing it anyway. Behind Abigail, the door opened. Aaron Voss stepped into the room and said nothing, watching. Winslow looked at Abigail. His voice, when it came, was tight. What are you proposing? Needle decompression. Right side, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right now. She had the 14-gauge needle in her hand. She hadn't consciously reached for it. And then a chest tube. The monitor alarm finally sounded. Winslow looked at the monitor, looked at the needle, looked at the patient, and then he stepped aside. The needle went in clean. Not perfectly. Nothing about a tension pneumothorax decompression was ever clean, really, because you were pushing metal through living tissue and the body didn't cooperate with what needed to be done to save it. But Abigail's hand was steady in the way that hands get steady after you've done something enough times in conditions bad enough that steadiness was the only option. The rush of air confirmed it before the monitor did. The soldier's oxygen saturation, which had been falling with the grim patience of a clock running down, began to climb. Nobody in the room said anything. Winslow stood 2 feet to her left with his arms at his sides and an expression she didn't look at because she didn't have attention to spare for his expression. She was already calling for the chest tube tray, already talking to Marcus, who had materialized at her elbow at some point in the last 90 seconds with the particular usefulness of someone who paid attention to things before being asked. Tray's here, Marcus said. Betadine, 10 blade, 32 French. Keep his pressure up. Where are we on fluids? Second bag just went in. Good. I need him at 30 degrees. She looked at the respiratory tech on the other side of the table, a young woman named Petra, who was watching Abigail with the wide, focused attention of someone recalibrating their entire understanding of a situation. Petra, you tracking his SATs? 91 and climbing. Tell me the second it plateaus. Yes. The chest tube took 4 minutes. Not because Abigail was slow, because a chest tube on a blast casualty with possible rib fractures was not a procedure you rushed through without consequence, and she made each step count with the methodical care of someone who had learned, the hard way, that haste in a trauma bay was a second injury waiting to happen. She talked through it, not for the room's benefit, not for Winslow. She wasn't even thinking about Winslow, but because narrating the steps kept the team calibrated, kept everyone's hands in the right place at the right moment. By the time she secured the tube and the drainage system began pulling what it needed to pull, the soldier's color had shifted. Not good, not yet, but less bad. The monitor was no longer threatening. The room's tension had changed its quality. Still present, but reorganized around stability rather than emergency. Colonel Voss hadn't moved from the doorway. Abigail stripped her outer gloves, checked the tube placement one more time by feel and by the sound of the system working, and then allowed herself to actually look at the patient. Really, look. Beyond the injury and the procedure, at the person on the table. Late 20s, maybe. A scar along his jaw that was old enough to be faded. His breathing was still labored, but it was his own breathing now, not the desperate mechanical mimicry of a body that was losing the argument. We need a surgical consult, she said, to no one specifically, to everyone in the room. He may have internal bleeding that the pneumo was masking. I want a fast exam before anyone gets comfortable. Dr. Mack, who had come in at some point during the procedure, was already moving toward the ultrasound machine. On it. Winslow said, "I'll call surgery." Abigail looked at him for the first time since she'd entered the bay. He didn't look angry, exactly. He looked like a man who had just watched something happen that was going to require him to reorganize a significant number of his assumptions, and who was not sure yet whether he was capable of doing that reorganization. She said, "Thank you, doctor," and meant it neutrally, because that was all she meant. She pulled off the rest of her protective gear and walked out of the bay. Voss followed her. They stood in the corridor just past the bay doors, far enough from the ongoing controlled chaos to speak without being in the middle of it. The hallway had that specific ER ambiance of sustained fluorescence and distant beeping, the baseline hum of a building that never fully went quiet. Abigail pressed her back against the wall and tilted her head back for a moment, not dramatically. She just needed to close her eyes for 3 seconds, and she gave herself those 3 seconds. "How long have you been here?" Voss said. 11 weeks. He absorbed that. He gestured carefully, not dismissively, but searching for a word. "This. Nursing, yes, sir. Abigail." He almost never used her first name. She noticed it. "You're one of the most decorated combat rescue medics the 38th ever produced. What you just did in there..." He stopped. "They didn't know?" "Nobody asked." "You didn't tell them?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him running through it. The math of it, the how and why of a person with her history ending up here, in these corridors, being asked to reorganize supply closets. She could see him wanting to ask the deeper question and deciding correctly that this was not the moment. "That's Sergeant Dominic Reyes in there," he said instead. "He's been with my unit for 6 years. He was in a training exercise when the charge went off. Wrong sequence, wrong distance. We had him stabilized in the field, but he deteriorated faster than anyone projected. He's going to need surgery. His spleen may be lacerated. Will he make it?" She thought about the honest answer, which was that she didn't know, that she never made promises about that because she had made them before and she had been wrong before. And the wrong ones were the ones she still heard in her sleep. "He's got a better chance than he did 20 minutes ago," she said. Voss nodded. That was enough. He'd asked those kinds of questions long enough to know that was the best answer you got. "I need to brief my team," he said. "But Abigail, we're going to talk, not tonight, but soon." He said it like a quiet directive, not a request. "You understand?" "Yes, sir." He walked back toward the bay. She watched him go, and then she turned and walked in the other direction, because there were still 6 hours left in her shift, and there were still patients who needed her, and she had spent enough time standing in corridors tonight. What she didn't account for was Donna Pritch, who was waiting at the nurse's station with a clipboard and an expression that had gone from her usual composed efficiency to something more complicated. "Dr. Winslow wants to speak with you," Dana said. "I'm sure he does." "Abigail," Dana lowered her voice. I want you to be careful, okay? I know what you did in there it was the right call. Everyone could see it was the right call, but I know what he is, Dana." Dana looked at her for a moment, then she stepped aside. Winslow's office was small and overfilled with the evidence of a man who had been important in the same building for too long, plaques and framed photographs, and the specific clutter of someone who had stopped needing to impress anyone new. He was standing behind his desk when Abigail came in, which she noted because it meant he'd chosen the geography of the conversation deliberately. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "I want you to explain to me," he said, his voice controlled in the way that controlled voices sometimes are when the control is covering something else, how a nurse, a floor nurse, who has been employed here for less than 3 months, decided to take over a trauma procedure in my bay without authorization. The patient was in acute respiratory failure. Waiting for authorization would have... That is not how this hospital works, Foster. I'm aware. Are you? He put both hands on his desk. Because what you did tonight, regardless of the outcome, was a direct violation of scope of practice. Nurses do not perform needle decompressions. Nurses do not insert chest tubes. Those are physician procedures, and you performed them without direction, without oversight, in front of military personnel, and a trauma team who now have a very distorted picture of what role you play in this department." Abigail stood with her hands at her sides and said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, because she had too much to say, and she was making a decision in real time about what portion of it was worth spending. "I'm going to need to file an incident report," Winslow said. "This may result in disciplinary review. HR will likely want to speak with you." "That's your prerogative, Doctor." "It is." He was watching her, she realized, for a reaction, for the particular kind of reaction that would give him information about her, about whether she was afraid, whether she would fight him, whether she would apologize. She gave him none of those things. She gave him stillness, which was something she had more of than he did. "Is there anything you want to say?" he said. "I'd like to get back to my patients." His jaw tightened. "You're off the floor for the rest of the shift. Go home, Foster." She left without raising her voice. She stopped at the nurse's station long enough to complete her outstanding documentation. Every chart, every note, every detail she was responsible for, done correctly, time-stamped, filed. Because she was not going to leave a gap that hurt a patient. Not even tonight. Not even now. Marcus watched her from across the station without saying anything. When she picked up her bag, he walked over. "He suspended you," Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Off the floor for tonight." "You saved that soldier's life." "I know." "And he's—" Marcus stopped himself, looked away, looked back. "What are you going to do?" Abigail slung her bag over her shoulder. "Go home. Come back tomorrow." She paused. "Make sure Reyes gets to surgery without any more delays. I'll watch him." "I know you will." She walked out through the staff exit, into the parking lot, into the cool Colorado evening where the mountains were dark shapes against a sky going deep blue at its edges. She sat in her truck for a moment without starting it. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. They hadn't shaken during the procedure. They hadn't shaken in Winslow's office. This was either a good sign about her or a sign she'd suppressed things too long. She'd had that argument with herself before and not conclusively won it. She started the truck. What she did not know, sitting in that parking lot, was that Colonel Voss had spent the 20 minutes since she'd left the trauma bay making phone calls. Not one phone call. A sequence of them. To Fort Callum's commanding officer, to a liaison at Joint Special Operations Command, and to a woman at the Department of Defense's Military Personnel Records Office who had answered on the second ring because Voss's calls did not go to voicemail. And she did not know that the medical student who had been standing in Bay 3 when Winslow dismissed her with a gesture had a name, Rachel Wu, and that Rachel Wu had been recording a voice memo on her phone all afternoon as part of her own clinical notes, a habit she'd developed in her first month of rotations, and that the recording had been running when Abigail said his trachea is deviated, and when Winslow said this is a restricted, and when the monitor alarm went off. The sequence of events in their original order, time-stamped, clear. And she did not know that Sergeant Dominic Reyes, who had gone into surgery at 7:14 p.m., had been conscious enough in the pre-op hold to say one thing to the anesthesiologist, who asked if he had any questions. Who was the woman? The nurse. Who was she? The anesthesiologist hadn't known, but 3 people in that hospital were about to start asking the same question in ways that Dr. Garrett Winslow was not going to be able to answer for them. Abigail drove home. She ate something she didn't taste. She sat at her kitchen table with the window dark behind her and opened her laptop and looked at the log she'd been keeping for 11 weeks. 43 entries, each one a documented failure of protocol or oversight or basic professional conduct, each one careful and specific and sourced. She had not written it to use. She had written it because it was the right thing to document. But sitting there, with Winslow's words still in her ears, and the image of Dominic Reyes's chest moving wrong and then right cycling through her memory, she thought about what Marcus had said. What are you waiting for? She didn't know anymore that she had a good answer to that. She opened a new document, began to type. The log entries organized themselves into something that had the structure and specificity of a formal complaint, not because she was forcing them into that shape, but because that's what they were, had always been. And she'd just been pretending otherwise. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Colorado area code she didn't recognize. She picked it up. Ms. Foster, The voice was a woman's, professional, no preamble. My name is Major Linda Hosta. I'm the medical affairs liaison at Fort Callum. Colonel Voss asked me to reach out to you directly. A pause. We need to talk about what happened tonight. Not as a courtesy, as a formal matter. Another pause, shorter. And I need to tell you, there's already a problem. Dr. Winslow contacted hospital administration 2 hours ago. He's filing a misconduct report and requesting your termination. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, something moved in the trees at the edge of the property. Wind or an animal, something that passed without leaving a mark. Miss Foster? I heard you, Abigail said. What kind of problem exactly? The kind, Major Host said carefully, where the hospital doesn't know yet what Winslow knows, which is that the nurse he's trying to fire is the reason one of our special operators is still breathing, and the kind where once we correct that misunderstanding, Dr. Winslow is going to have a very different set of problems than the ones he thinks he has right now. Abigail said, Tell me what you need from me. Major Host didn't waste time with preamble. That was the first thing Abigail respected about her. She had the particular efficiency of someone who had spent years translating between institutional language and the actual shape of a problem. She laid it out directly. Winslow had contacted the hospital's chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Paxton, at 8:47 p.m. He had framed the incident report as a scope of practice violation by a probationary nurse who had interfered with an active trauma procedure, endangered a patient, and behaved in a manner inconsistent with hospital policy. He had not notably mentioned that the patient was a military special operator. He had not mentioned Colonel Voss. He had not mentioned that the patient was alive because of what Abigail had done. He filed before we could make contact with hospital administration, Host said, which means right now Paxton has one version of tonight's events, ours. And yours is different. Ours is documented, time-stamped, and supported by the testimony of Colonel Voss and 3 members of his team who were present in that trauma bay. A pause. We also have Sergeant Reyes's surgical team confirming that the chest tube was correctly placed and the decompression was clinically indicated. The surgeon on his case, a doctor, Osman, was fairly emphatic about that. Her word was unambiguous. Abigail absorbed this. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to push something light across the porch. A leaf or a piece of paper, she couldn't tell. What do you need from me specifically? A formal statement tonight, if possible, because Paxton is meeting with his HR director first thing tomorrow morning, and we want our account in front of him before that meeting happens. Hoste's voice was precise, but not cold. I also want to be honest with you. The military's interest here is in Sergeant Reyes' care and in ensuring that the person responsible for his survival is not punished for it. What happens to Dr. Winslow afterward is a hospital matter. We can apply pressure, but we can't make that decision for them. I understand. Do you have documentation of prior incidents? Anything that establishes a pattern? Abigail looked at the open document on her laptop. 43 entries. Yes. A silence that was not quite surprise. How extensive? 11 weeks of it. Another silence, longer. Miss Foster, Host said, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite admiration, but the recognition of it. I'm going to need you to email that to me tonight. Abigail sent it at 10:23 p.m. Then she wrote her statement, 4 pages, single-spaced, chronological, specific. She did not editorialize. She did not use words like unfair or humiliating or wrong. She used words like, at 1732, doctor. Winslow redirected me from triage coverage to supply organization without clinical justification, and patient oxygen saturation was falling at a rate inconsistent with the timeline required to obtain imaging, and the procedure was performed in accordance with PHTLS protocol and TCCC guidelines, consistent with my training and certification. She signed it with her name and her nursing license number and her Air Force service record number, which she had not written down anywhere in 11 weeks, and which she typed from memory without pausing. She sent it at 11:51 p.m. and sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a while after. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and a little hollow, the way you felt after adrenaline finished with you. Not bad exactly, just emptied out. She thought about Dominic Reyes in a surgical suite somewhere above her, and she thought about the sound his chest had made when the air released, and she thought about Voss standing in the bay doorway, watching her with an expression she still hadn't fully processed. She went to bed at 12:30. She slept badly, which was normal. She was used to it. Her phone woke her at 5:47 a.m. Marcus. "You need to get here," he said. No hello. Paxton called an emergency staff meeting for 7 a.m. Word is he's announcing your termination before anyone has a chance to say anything. She sat up. "Where did you hear that?" "Dana." Dana heard it from Paxton's assistant. A pause. "Abigail, there's something else. That medical student, Rachel Wu, she's been talking about what she saw yesterday, what Winslow said to you in the bay before it all went down. She talked to 2 other students, and apparently one of them went to the residency director last night." Another pause. "I don't know if it's enough." "I'll be there at 6:30, she said. She arrived at 6:28, which was earlier than she'd promised, because she drove faster than she should have on the mountain roads and didn't think about it. The hospital parking lot had more cars than usual for this hour. She counted 2 government-plated vehicles near the main entrance that hadn't been there yesterday, and a third one she didn't recognize parked in the fire lane with the deliberate disregard of someone who didn't expect to be ticketed. Inside, the early morning ER had the specific quality of a room where the night shift had not fully handed over yet. The ceiling lights still felt nocturnal, the energy slightly underwater. Marcus was at the nurse's station, talking to Petra in a low voice that stopped when Abigail walked in. Petra looked at her with an expression that was part relief and part something else Abigail couldn't parse yet. "Reyes is out of surgery," Marcus said immediately. "Splenic laceration. They controlled it. He's in the ICU, but he's stable." The tension in Abigail's chest that she hadn't fully acknowledged released by a degree. "Good." "There's more." Marcus glanced down the hall. "Voss has been here since 6. He's in Paxton's office right now. Him and another officer. A woman I didn't recognize. Major Hoste. You know her?" "I spoke with her last night." Abigail set her bag down behind the station. "What's the room situation for the meeting?" Paxton booked the main conference room, 2nd floor. Marcus looked at her directly. "Are you going?" "Yes." "Even though I'm still employed here until someone tells me otherwise in writing. I'm going." She didn't go straight to the conference room. She went first to the ICU, not because she had clinical responsibility for Dominic Reyes right now, but because she needed to see him. The ICU charge nurse, a compact, careful man named Adewale, who she'd had minimal interaction with before, looked at her badge when she came in, then looked at her face, then stepped back and let her through without asking for a reason. Reyes was in the 3rd bay, intubated, sedated. The monitor showed everything they needed to show and nothing alarming. He looked younger unconscious than he had on the trauma table, which was a trick the body played. The effort of staying alert aged people, and when that effort was suspended, you saw something closer to the original. He had the particular stillness of someone who had gone as far as the body could go and then been pulled back, and who was now in the place between those 2 poles where healing happened slowly and without drama. Abigail stood beside his bed for 90 seconds. She checked his lines, checked the drainage output, checked the ventilator settings against the numbers in his chart. Everything was correct. She made one note, a minor adjustment to his positioning that would improve drainage marginally, and left it in the chart as a suggestion, not an order, because that was her lane and she knew it. She walked out of the ICU and took the stairs to the 2nd floor. The conference room had a glass wall facing the corridor, which meant she could see who was inside before she opened the door. Paxton was there, a broad man in his late 50s with the expensive watch and careful haircut of someone who thought of administration as a form of performance. 2 HR staff she recognized by sight. Dr. Winslow, seated at the far end of the table with his hands folded in the posture of someone who had already won the argument in his head and was waiting for the room to catch up. And across the table from Winslow, Colonel Voss and Major Linda Host. Host was everything her voice had suggested, 40, precise, with the specific composure of someone who had been in uncomfortable rooms before and had learned to occupy them without apology. She had a folder in front of her that was closed, and she was not looking at it. She was looking at Paxton with the patient attention of someone waiting for the right moment to place something on a table. Abigail pushed the door open. Every head turned. Winslow's expression, when he saw her, moved through several things quickly. Surprise, irritation, then a settling back into confidence that she recognized as a man reminding himself that he had already won. "This meeting is for hospital leadership," he said. "This is not appropriate." "Mr. Paxton." Abigail addressed the COO directly. "I'm Abigail Foster. I'm a floor nurse on the ER staff. I understand there's a matter being discussed that directly concerns me, and I'd like to be present." Paxton looked at her, then at Winslow, then at Voss, who had not moved or changed expression. The geometry of that look told Abigail something about how the last hour had gone. Paxton was a man who had walked into this room with one set of assumptions and had spent 60 minutes finding out that the ground was less stable than he'd thought. "Sit down, Ms. Foster," Paxton said. Winslow straightened. "Gerald, I don't think—" "Garrett." Paxton's voice was flat. "Sit down." The temperature in the room shifted by a degree that everyone felt and no one acknowledged. Poste opened her folder. What came out of that folder was not a dramatic revelation. Real institutional documentation rarely was. It was a sequence of papers passed to Paxton in a particular order, each one building on the last with the patience of an argument that had been constructed overnight by people who knew what they were doing. First, Sergeant Reyes's medical record, with the surgical team's documentation of his presenting condition. Second, the attending surgeon's written assessment, which included the phrase timely field-appropriate intervention prevented almost certain fatality in language that was so specific it was clearly not a courtesy. Third, Voss's formal statement, 3 pages, which Abigail had not seen but which she watched Paxton read with an expression that moved from polite attention to something more complicated. "Colonel Voss," Paxton said, looking up, "this states that Ms. Foster's intervention was, quote, the sole clinical action that prevented Sergeant Reyes's death in the trauma bay. That's your assessment?" "That's the assessment of everyone present," Voss said, "including your trauma surgeon." Paxton looked at Winslow. Winslow said, "The patient had not been formally assessed at that point. The intervention was premature and outside protocol, regardless of the outcome." "Dr. Winslow." Host's voice was pleasant, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. "I'd like to direct your attention to page 4 of Miss Foster's personnel file." She passed another paper to Paxton, not to Winslow. Specifically, her certifications. Abigail had not seen this document either. She watched Paxton read it, watched his eyes move down the page, watched them stop and go back, and move down again. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Paxton set the paper down. He looked at Winslow. "Garrett, were you aware of Ms. Foster's military background when you hired her?" "Her application listed prior military service. That's not uncommon." "Her application listed—" Paxton looked at the paper again. "Combat Rescue Officer Certification. TCCC Advanced Qualification. 14 months as a flight medic with the 38th Rescue Squadron. 2 Air Force Commendation Medals." He paused. "And a citation for the Airman's Medal for an extraction under direct enemy fire." He set the paper down with a quietness that was, itself, a statement. "You hired her for floor nursing." Winslow's jaw tightened. Her nursing credentials were the basis of her application. "And in 11 weeks, Paxton said, did anyone on your staff at any point ask why a combat-decorated Air Force medic was reorganizing supply closets?" The silence that followed had a weight to it that was different from the silences before it. It had the specific quality of an answer that everyone in the room already knew, and that nobody wanted to be the one to say out loud. Then Host placed the last document on the table. She did it without commentary. She passed it to Paxton and folded her hands and waited. Abigail recognized it. She had emailed it last night. 43 entries, 11 weeks of documented procedural failures, missed protocols, dismissed flags, patients whose care had been compromised by the slow accumulation of a department that had stopped checking itself against any standard beyond its chief physician's confidence in his own judgment. She had written it without knowing if she would ever use it. She had written it because she couldn't not write it, because the alternative was watching the gaps get wider and saying nothing, and she was not made for saying nothing when people were getting hurt. Paxton read the first page, then the second. The HR staff member beside him leaned over and began reading simultaneously, and her expression at some point around the third entry changed in a way that suggested she understood what she was looking at. Winslow had gone very still. "Mr. Paxton," he said carefully, "I want to note that this document was prepared by a probationary employee with a personal grievance against her supervisor. The credibility of the document references specific patient case numbers," the HR staff member said. She hadn't introduced herself to Abigail, but her voice was precise. "I can pull the records for verification right now." "Then pull them," Paxton said. Winslow stood up. It was not a planned movement. Abigail could see that. It was the physical response of a man whose body had decided to do something before his brain had authorized it, and the effect was that it made him look reactive in a room where everyone else was sitting down. "I have given 21 years to this hospital," he said. "I have built this department, whatever procedural concerns this nurse has." He gestured at Abigail with a dismissiveness that was so automatic it was almost involuntary. "They can be addressed through proper channels, not by inviting military officials into an internal personnel matter." Voss spoke for the first time since the folder had been opened. He did it without raising his voice. "The military is present because one of our people almost died in your department last night. We're not here about a personnel matter, Doctor. We're here because the woman who saved his life is being removed from her position for doing it." He paused. "And because the documentation on that table suggests it wasn't an isolated failure of judgment." Winslow looked at Voss. Something moved in his face that Abigail had not seen there before. Not anger, which she'd seen plenty of, but something closer to the recognition that the room had shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated and couldn't recover from by performing the authority he was used to having. He sat back down. Paxton closed the folder. He looked at Abigail for a long moment, really looked, the way he clearly hadn't when she was simply a name on an incident report. "Ms. Foster," he said, "I want to be direct with you. As of this morning, the termination proceedings initiated by Dr. Winslow are suspended pending full review." He glanced at the HR staff member, who nodded. "We will be conducting an independent audit of the cases documented in your report. That process will take time." "I understand," Abigail said. "I also want to say—" He stopped, seemed to be choosing words. "I'm not in a position to make any formal statements until the audit is complete, but I want you to know that what I've heard this morning it's going to require a serious conversation about how this department operates." It was not an apology. It was the shape of an apology, minus the actual words. She'd been in enough rooms like this to know the difference, and to know that the distinction mattered less than whether the outcome changed. "Thank you," she said. Because it was the appropriate response, and because she meant it in the limited way she meant it. She walked out. The corridor was empty except for Marcus, who was standing 20 feet from the conference room door with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had been waiting without any ability to do anything useful, which was its own kind of difficult. He looked at her face when she came out and read it with the accuracy of someone who paid attention. "Still employed?" he said. "For now." "Winslow?" "Still in the room." She kept walking. "How's the floor?" "Busy. We've got a chest pain in 3 that Mac's handling and a pediatric head trauma that just came in." He fell into step beside her. "You should know. 2 of the medical students from yesterday have given statements to the residency director, and Rachel Wu apparently went to the department chair as well." Abigail stopped walking. "On her own?" "Nobody asked her to. She just did it." She thought about Rachel Wu. The dark eyes, the quick look away when Winslow had gestured her out of the bay, the look of someone filing something away. "Is the department chair involved now?" "Dr. Ewan. She's been in her office since 7. Marcus hesitated. "Abigail, this is getting bigger than the hospital. Voss has been making calls. There are people from Fort Callum's legal office who arrived an hour ago. Whatever happens in that conference room, it's not going to stay in that conference room." She absorbed that, started walking again. "Then I need to be on the floor doing my job. Because whatever else is happening, there are patients here. She pulled gloves from the dispenser at the hallway entrance and walked toward Bay 3. Doctor. Mac was with the chest pain patient, a 57-year-old named Harold Bryce, a former miner with the specific defensive hostility of a man who distrusted hospitals and had ended up in one anyway. His EKG was equivocal. His troponins were pending. He was arguing with Mac about whether he actually needed to stay, making the specific argument that men of his generation made about their own bodies, that they knew when something was wrong and this wasn't it. Abigail came in, picked up his chart, scanned it. Mr. Bryce? She said it without buildup. When did the shoulder pain start? He looked at her. What shoulder pain? Your left shoulder. When did it start? A pause. Yesterday morning. I thought I pulled something. She looked at Mac. Mac was already writing. It took another 40 minutes to establish that Harold Bryce was having a slow STEMI, the kind that presented atypically in older male patients with high pain tolerance, the kind that looked like a shoulder strain until it didn't, the kind that killed people who went home instead of staying. He went to the cath lab at 9:14 a.m., grumbling the entire time, and Abigail watched the gurney disappear around the corner and went to the pediatric head trauma. The morning moved the way mornings moved when they were busy, in the particular way that genuine clinical work absorbed everything else, where the noise of the institutional drama happening 2 floors above her became background radiation. She did not stop thinking about it. She was not capable of stopping thinking about it. But she also did not let it take her hands away from the work, because the work was what she was here for, and the work was the only argument she had ever made that she fully believed in. At 11:30, Colonel Voss found her in the hallway outside the pediatric bay. He looked like a man who had been in a room doing something unpleasant for 4 hours, which was accurate. There was a tiredness in his face that hadn't been there last night. Not defeat, but the specific drain of having fought on institutional terrain, which was its own kind of warfare, and not one he had trained for. Paxton is going to launch a formal review of Winslow's department, he said. The Fort Callum legal office has formally notified the hospital that Sergeant Reyes's care will be subject to external audit as part of a military injury investigation. That gives them access to everything: charts, protocols, incident reports, personnel files. Abigail said, "That's significant. It means the hospital can't manage this internally. It becomes a matter of record." He paused. Your documentation was... Hostess said she's seen formal complaints from senior staff with less rigor than what you put together. She said nothing to that. I want to ask you something, Voss said. He said it carefully, the way he'd said her name last night in the parking bay, like the words had weight he was being deliberate about. Why did you leave? The 38th. You were... What you did in that tour, Abigail, the citation doesn't even... He stopped. Why did you walk away? She looked at him for a moment. The honest answer was not simple, and it was not hers alone. It belonged also to a name she didn't say out loud in hospitals, to a decision made in a base in Kandahar province, to the specific mechanics of a training accident that had taken 2 people she would have given anything to bring back and hadn't been able to, and to the weight of that, which was different from guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood. I needed to start over, she said, somewhere where I wasn't who I used to be. Voss looked at her for a long time. And now? She didn't have an answer for that yet. She thought she might have been building toward one, slowly, in a way she hadn't quite admitted to herself. I don't know, she said, which was honest. He nodded, like that was an acceptable answer. It probably was. Reyes is asking for you, he said. They're going to extubate this afternoon if he stays stable. He's been asking since he came around from the anesthesia. I'll go up when my shift covers. Voss turned to leave, then stopped. There's something else, something you should know before this afternoon. He turned back and his expression had changed in a way that made her still. The incident report Winslow filed last night. It wasn't the first. He filed one in September as well, against a nurse named Clara Teo who left the department 6 weeks ago. Same pattern. Scope of practice violation. Insubordination. She was gone before anyone looked into it. His voice was even. Paxton didn't know there was a prior filing. He knows now. Abigail felt something cold move through her that was not quite anger. How many people has he done this to? That's what the review is going to find out, Voss said. But Abigail, he paused, and she could see him deciding whether to say the next thing and deciding to say it. I called the 38th medical office this morning. Not to interfere, just I wanted people to know you were here, that you were doing good work. He met her eyes. I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to see it. She held that for a moment without responding. Then her pager went off. She looked at it. ICU. Reyes's bay number. She was already moving before the second page came through, and she was 3 steps down the corridor when her radio crackled with the ICU charge nurse's voice. Adewale. Steady, but clipped in the way he wasn't usually clipped. Dr. Foster, I need you up here. Reyes is showing arrhythmia. New onset, rapid, and we can't reach his surgical team. She ran. He had called her Dr. Foster, which he'd never called her before, which she didn't have a thought to spare for because she was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, and she was already running through the differential in her head. Post-op arrhythmia in a blast casualty with a repaired splenic lac and a thoracic injury, possible causes in descending order of probability, intervention options in descending order of speed, and she pushed through the ICU doors and saw immediately that the monitor at Reyes's bedside was showing something that required a decision in the next 4 minutes, and that the only physician currently visible in the ICU was a first-year resident who was standing at the bedside with the expression of someone who knew what they were looking at and did not know what to do about it. What's his potassium? She said. The resident, a young man whose name tag said Delgado, said, Last draw was 3.1. That was 2 hours ago. When did the arrhythmia start? 8 minutes ago. I paged cardiology, but they're in a procedure, and is there a defibrillator in the bay? Yes, but he's not in. It's not VFIB. I know what it is. She was already at the medication cart, already reading the chart's last set of labs, already building the intervention in her head. Get me an IV magnesium sulfate, 2 grams, and I need his surgical attending on the phone in the next 2 minutes. Delgado reached for his phone. His hands were shaking slightly. She noted it and said nothing because it was not the problem right now. The problem right now was that Dominic Reyes's heart was doing something that it would stop doing on its own if it didn't get help shortly, and the help was here, and Abigail was going to provide it, and the institutional architecture of who was authorized to do what was going to have to work itself out afterward. She was not particularly worried about afterward. She was worried about the next 4 minutes. She pulled a stool to the bedside and began talking to Reyes, not because he could respond, he was still sedated, but because she had always talked to her patients and she was not going to stop now. She told him what she was doing and why. She told him the magnesium would help. She told him that his surgical team was coming and that he had survived considerably worse than a post-op arrhythmia, and that his heart was going to settle down. The magnesium went in at 11:47 a.m. By 11:53, the monitor had begun to show what she needed to see. By 11:58, when the cardiology fellow finally arrived in a controlled rush, with an attending 2 steps behind her, the crisis had resolved enough that Reyes's rhythm was stabilizing and the immediate emergency had passed, and the cardiology fellow stopped in the doorway and looked at the monitor, and then looked at Abigail sitting at the bedside with an empty syringe in her gloved hand and said, "What happened?" Abigail told her. The fellow listened, pulled up the rhythm strip on the monitor, nodded twice. Then she looked at Abigail's badge, looked at her face. "Are you the nurse from the ER?" she said. "The one who did the decompression last night?" "Yes." The fellow looked at the monitor again, then at Abigail. "Okay," she said. Just that. But the way she said it carried something. At 12:34 p.m., Abigail walked out of the ICU for the second time that day. She stopped in the corridor and stood still for a moment with her back against the wall, eyes closed, doing the 3-second reset she gave herself when she needed it. When she opened them, Rachel Wu was standing 12 feet away, clearly having been there for at least a minute, clearly not sure whether to approach. Abigail looked at her. "You gave a statement to the department chair." "Yes." Rachel's voice was careful. "I thought someone should." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Rachel looked at her steadily. "But I watched him dismiss you twice yesterday before everything happened, and I thought, If this is how people get treated when they're right and he's wrong, then someone needs to say something. A pause. I'm a first-month student. I don't have anything to lose yet. Abigail studied her for a moment. Ghetto. There was something familiar in Rachel Wu's expression, the particular set of a person who had decided to do a thing they were afraid to do and had done it anyway. She'd seen it on people under fire. She'd probably worn it herself more times than she could count. Thank you, she said. Rachel nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. Dr. Ewan wants to speak with you, the department chair, she said when you have a moment. She paused. She didn't look like someone who was going to make your morning worse. Abigail pushed off the wall. Where is she? Rachel pointed. She walked. The department chair's office was at the end of the administrative wing, a corner room with windows that faced the mountains. Dr. Ewan was 60, small, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had been making consequential decisions for a long time and had learned to make them without performing the weight of them. She stood when Abigail came in, which was a thing that Abigail registered and immediately set aside. Sit down, Ms. Foster, Ewan said. I've been reading your documentation all morning. I've also spoken with Colonel Voss, Major Hoste, and Dr. Osman, who operated on Sergeant Reyes. Abigail sat. I also received a call 40 minutes ago from the Joint Special Operations Command medical advisor in Colorado Springs, Ewan said, which is not something that happens often. Abigail said nothing. I want to be honest with you. Ewan set her hands flat on the desk. The review that's been launched will take several weeks. The military audit adds a layer of process that we can't accelerate. But there are interim decisions I have authority to make right now, and I intend to make them. She paused. Effective today, Doctor. Winslow is removed from his role as chief physician of the emergency department, pending the outcome of the review. He will remain on staff in a non-supervisory capacity until the process is complete. The room was very quiet. I also want to discuss your role going forward, Ewan said. Your certifications are, Ms. Foster, your qualifications substantially exceed your current position. I'd like to understand why you applied as a floor nurse rather than in a clinical specialist or advanced practice capacity. Abigail considered the question. The real answer was that she had applied as a floor nurse because she hadn't trusted herself yet to be anything more. Because the version of herself that had held people's lives in her hands in Afghanistan was someone she wasn't sure still existed intact, and she'd needed to find out quietly, in a context small enough to absorb the possibility that she might not be that person anymore. I needed to start somewhere, she said. Ewan looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same vicinity. Well, she said, you've established that you're somewhere. She picked up a pen. I'd like to discuss a temporary clinical coordinator role while the review proceeds, with full authority to flag procedural concerns directly to my office. That's not a permanent position. We'll have a conversation about permanent when the dust settles. But I want someone with your background in a formal oversight capacity while the department restabilizes. She set the pen down. What do you think? What Abigail thought was that 11 weeks ago she had walked into this building carrying a thermos of bad coffee and a history she wasn't ready to be known for, and that she had spent those 11 weeks moving through its corridors like furniture, and that the distance between that and this moment was not something she had a language for yet. What she said was, I'll need to think about it. Ewan nodded. Take until tomorrow morning. Abigail stood to leave. Miss Foster. Ewan's voice stopped her at the door. The medical student who gave the statement, Rachel Wu, I'd like you to know that it was specific enough and credible enough that it significantly accelerated this morning's decisions. Whatever you did to earn that kind of witness in 11 weeks, that matters. Abigail stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked out into the corridor and turned toward the stairs, and was halfway down the first flight when her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus that read only, Winslow just left the building. Security escorted him to his car. You need to see the ER right now. She stopped on the landing, read it again. Then she kept going down, faster than before, because something in those words, not the news about Winslow, but the you need to see, had the specific quality of information she was not going to be prepared for, and there was only one way to find out what it meant. She hit the bottom of the stairwell and pushed through the door into the main corridor and stopped. The ER was full. Not full in the way an emergency department was usually full. The controlled density of patients and staff moving through a system designed to process them. Full in a different way. The waiting area, which at this hour typically held 6 or 8 people in various states of discomfort, had perhaps 20 in it, and they were not the usual mix of the injured and the ill. Families. Some of them in the particular clothing of people who had driven a long distance without planning to. A woman in her 60s with red eyes and a paper coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. A man in his 30s with his hands clasped between his knees, leaning forward, watching the desk. Marcus materialized at her elbow. "They started showing up at 11, he said, low. "Word got out about Winslow. Not from us. I don't know where it started. But people have been coming in asking for patient records, asking questions about prior treatment, asking to speak with someone in administration." He paused. 3 of them have lawyers. Abigail looked at the waiting area, looked at the desk, where Roz was handling the intake with the steady efficiency of someone who had seen hard days before, but was nonetheless aware that this particular day was different. How many are Winslow's former patients? At least 12 that we know of? Could be more. Marcus kept his voice down. "There's a woman in the consult room, room 4. She came in with her son. She's asking specifically about a missed diagnosis from 8 months ago. Broken orbital fracture that Winslow cleared as a contusion. Her son lost partial vision in his left eye." He looked at her. "She heard about the documentation review. She wants to know if her case is in there." Abigail thought about this. 43 entries in her log. She had documented what she'd witnessed herself, what she could personally verify. She had not documented what she couldn't see, which meant that whatever was in that log was a floor, not a ceiling. "Did Paxton know this was happening?" she said. "I think he's finding out right now." Marcus tilted his head toward the administrative corridor. "His assistant has been going back and forth to HR for the last 20 minutes. Abigail went to the nurse's station and picked up the chart for room 4. The patient was named Dora Kimball, 64. Her son was named Patrick, 31. The chief complaint listed by the intake nurse read, "Family request, prior care, no acute medical concern," which was the clinical equivalent of a form not having a box for what was actually happening. She knocked and pushed the door open. Dora Kimball was a compact woman with the specific composure of someone who had spent months deciding whether to come here and had come anyway. Her son Patrick sat beside her, and his left eye, when Abigail looked at him, not obtrusively, just with the unavoidable clinical attention that she couldn't turn off, showed the subtle asymmetry of a surgical correction that had addressed some damage, but not all of it. The iris was slightly irregular. The tracking was off by a degree that most people would never notice, and that she noticed immediately. "Mrs. Kimball," she said, and sat down, which was the first thing. Sitting down was the thing that said, "I have time for you," in a language that rooms like this spoke fluently. "I'm Abigail Foster. I'm a nurse in this department. I want to understand why you came in today." Dora looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone who had encountered enough medical professionals to know the difference between the ones who were managing her and the ones who were listening. She seemed to make a decision. "Patrick came in 8 months ago. Car accident. He had pain and swelling around his eye, and severe, he could barely open it. They took x-rays. Dr. Winslow examined him and told us it was soft tissue bruising. Sent us home with ibuprofen." She paused. 3 weeks later, a different doctor, at a clinic in Glenwood Springs, saw him and immediately sent him for a CT. He had a blowout fracture of the orbital floor. By then, the muscle had been trapped for weeks. The damage was... She stopped, looked at her son. Patrick said, "I lost about 30% of my upward gaze. I had surgery, but they couldn't get it all back." Abigail held the file. She looked at the dates. She did not look at them with surprise, because she was past being surprised, but she looked at them with the specific attention of someone who understood what they meant. "Were you informed about the option to seek a second opinion at the time of the initial examination?" she said. "No," Dora said. "Were you given written discharge instructions that included return precautions for worsening vision or eye movement?" "We were handed a paper about rest and ice," Abigail wrote in her notebook. Not the formal log. That document was already with Host. This was her own working notes, the first step of something that was going to require a specific kind of careful. I'm going to be honest with you about what I can and can't tell you today, she said. There's an active review of this department's practice history. Your son's case, based on what you've described, may be relevant to that review. I'm going to make sure that the person overseeing the review has your contact information and that this visit is formally documented. She paused. That's the institutional step. What I can tell you, and I want to be clear that this is preliminary, is that the pattern you're describing is consistent with what we're finding in other cases. Dora looked at her steadily. Is this the first time someone has sat down and actually told us something? I can't speak to what happened in previous conversations, Abigail said, but I can tell you that this one is being documented and that you matter to this process. She spent 40 minutes with the Kimballs, not because procedure required 40 minutes, but because the situation required it. The careful work of documenting their account with enough specificity to be useful, of explaining the audit process without overpromising, of sitting with a woman who had spent 8 months convinced that the system had failed her son and was only now getting confirmation that she had not imagined it. When she came out, the corridor had gotten busier. HR had sent 2 staff members down to begin triaging the families in the waiting area. A woman from the hospital's patient advocacy office, someone Abigail had never interacted with before. A compact, serious person named Yolanda, who wore her ID on a lanyard and carried a clipboard with the efficiency of someone who had been called in on short notice and had shown up anyway, was moving through the waiting area with the specific purpose of taking names and distributing her direct contact information. Dana was at the main desk, and she looked up when Abigail passed and said, "Abigail," in a voice that made Abigail stop. "There's a call for you," Dana said. "I was going to leave a message, but it's the Joint Special Operations Command medical advisor, the one Ewan spoke with this morning." Abigail looked at her. "They called the main desk?" "They called the main desk and asked for you by name." Dana held out the phone receiver with an expression that had moved past her habitual controlled professionalism into something more direct. "I don't know what you did in your life before this," Dana said quietly, "but I'm starting to understand that I should have asked." Abigail took the phone, turned slightly so the conversation had a degree of privacy. "This is Foster." The voice on the other end was a man's, measured, the specific cadence of someone who had a rank that required people to listen when he spoke, and who was accustomed to that. He introduced himself as Colonel Douglas Marsh, JSOC Medical Advisor, Colorado Springs. He had, he said, been briefed by both Colonel Voss and Major Host on the events at Riverside Valley over the past 18 hours. He had also, he said, reviewed her service record. "I want to ask you something directly," Marsh said, "and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "Yes, sir." "In your assessment, was Sergeant Reyes's care last night adequate by civilian trauma standards? Setting aside your specific intervention, was the department prepared for what walked through that door?" She thought about the question. The honest answer was the one she gave. "No," she said. The trauma team's response was slower than the clinical picture required. The initial assessment didn't account for the blast mechanism, and the decision to delay based on imaging rather than clinical presentation was a mistake that would have been fatal in a different window of time. A pause. That's what Dr. Osmond indicated as well. Another pause. "Ms. Foster, Fort Callum is the designated trauma facility partner for our special operations units. We rotate casualties here because of proximity. That relationship is predicated on this facility meeting a certain standard." He let that sit for a moment. "I think you understand why I'm telling you this. The relationship is under review," she said. "The relationship is under active reassessment," he said, "which creates a problem for the hospital and frankly creates a problem for us in terms of casualty coverage in this region. I've been asked by my commanding officer to recommend a path forward." He paused. "I'd like your read on whether this department can be brought up to standard and on what timeline." She was standing at the nurse's station of an ER that was handling a crisis of its own creation while fielding families of injured patients and processing the removal of its chief physician, and a colonel in Colorado Springs was asking her for a clinical quality assessment. "I'd need more than a phone call to give you a responsible answer to that," she said. "Fair. Can you come to Fort Callum? When? Tomorrow. We'll send a vehicle. She said she'd be there. She handed the phone back to Dana, who was pretending not to have listened and had clearly heard every word. Dana put the receiver down without comment, then said, "You need to eat something. You haven't eaten since you got here." It was 1:47 p.m. Abigail accepted half a sandwich from the break room with the particular grace of someone who couldn't afford to argue about it, ate it standing at the counter in 4 minutes, and went back to work. The afternoon had the quality of a day reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. The patients still came: a construction fall, a diabetic episode, a frightened mother with a feverish infant, and the work of seeing them was unchanged from any other afternoon, except that it was happening inside a department that had cracked open and was still figuring out what its shape was going to be on the other side. Abigail moved through it without stopping to examine it, because examining it wasn't her job right now. Her job was the work. The rest was going to happen whether she watched it or not. At 3:15, Winslow came back. Not in the way that security escorting someone to their car was supposed to prevent, not through the main entrance, but through the physician's entrance on the east side of the building, which required a badge and which his badge still opened because nobody had deactivated it yet, which was the kind of administrative gap that happened when processes moved faster than the systems that implemented them. Abigail was in Bay 2 with a 16-year-old with a suspected wrist fracture when she heard his voice in the corridor. The specific timbre of it, the particular register of a man who felt he was being wronged and had decided to do something about that feeling in person rather than through proper channels. She heard him say, "I want to speak with Dr. Yuen. I want to speak with her right now, and I want someone to tell me on what authority." She heard Roz's voice, steady. "Dr. Winslow, you've been asked to—" "I have 21 years in this hospital, and I am not going to be walked out by a security guard because of a complaint filed by a probationary nurse." The 16-year-old, whose name was Tyler, looked up at her with the alert attention of a teenager who had correctly identified that something was happening outside this room. "Is that bad?" he said. "Hold still," Abigail said, and kept her hands where they were. She completed the wrist assessment. She documented it. She told Tyler's mother, who had the tight-eyed look of a woman measuring everything in this building against a standard it might not meet, that she'd want radiology to confirm, but that it presented as a distal radius fracture and they'd have imaging in about 20 minutes. She said all of this in a normal voice with normal pacing, and then she walked out into the corridor. Winslow was at the nurse's station. He had a folder in his hand, physical paper, not a tablet, and he was holding it in the way people held things when they needed something to hold. Two nurses Abigail didn't recognize by name were watching from the medication room doorway with the frozen attention of people who weren't sure if they were supposed to intervene or disappear. Roz was standing between Winslow and the station's main counter with her arms at her sides, which was not a defensive posture exactly, but was the posture of a woman who had decided where she was standing and was not going to move. Marcus was at the far end of the station, watching Abigail's face. Winslow saw her. His expression, when he did, cycled through several things that she read without difficulty. Recognition, the specific anger of a man who had identified the source of his problems, and beneath that, because she was looking carefully, something that was not quite fear but was in its family. "Foster," he said. "Dr. Winslow." She kept her voice even. "You've been asked to leave the building." "By people who don't understand what they've done," he said. "Do you know what this review is going to do to this department? Do you understand what happens to the staff here, to the patients here, when an ER department gets flagged by the state medical board? You think this is justice? You've handed this hospital to the regulators and congratulated yourself for it." She looked at him. "The patients in the waiting room whose cases weren't managed correctly, is that also my fault? Every department has outliers. Every department has cases that don't go perfectly. You've taken that normal margin of error and turned it into—" "Patrick Kimball," she said. He stopped. 31 years old. Orbital blowout fracture cleared as a contusion. 30% loss of upward gaze. That's not a margin of error, Dr. Winslow. That's a person who can't look up anymore. The corridor was very quiet. Winslow's jaw moved. Something worked through his face that she couldn't fully name, Not guilt, not quite, but the specific expression of a man who had found a way to not think about something for a long time and was now being made to think about it. "I make hundreds of decisions a year," he said. I know," she said. And she did know. That was the thing that was complicated about him, the thing that had kept her log entries factual rather than personal. He was not a villain from a story. He was a competent physician who had been unchecked long enough that his confidence had grown past the point where it could correct itself. And the people who had suffered for that were not abstractions, but they also were not the product of malice. They were the product of a system that hadn't been watching. She had been watching. That was all. She had been watching and writing it down. "The review will determine what it determines," she said. "Your presence here right now isn't going to change that. It's only going to make things worse for you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the folder in his hands, and she understood that he had come back with it for some specific purpose. Perhaps to present something to Paxton, perhaps to make some argument about his record. She didn't know, and it no longer mattered. He set the folder on the counter, turned, walked back toward the east entrance. Nobody said anything until the door had closed. Then Roz exhaled through her nose, not dramatically, just the physiological release of tension held for too long, and turned back to her desk and said, "Someone needs to call facilities about his badge." "I'll call," Marcus said. The afternoon finished. The audit team from the State Medical Board's regional office arrived at 4:30, not because the hospital had called them, but because Fort Callum's legal office had, which was a chain of communication that had its own specific efficiency. There were 3 of them. 2 clinical auditors and a documentation specialist who came equipped with portable hard drives and the particular focused patience of people who had done this before in other hospitals and knew exactly what they were looking for. Paxton met them in the lobby. Abigail watched from the corridor without approaching, because this was not her meeting. This was an institutional process that she had helped set in motion and that now had its own momentum and did not need her to push it. She went back upstairs to check on Reyes. He had been extubated at 2:45 p.m., which was slightly ahead of the surgical team's initial projection, which the ICU nurse told her with the particular satisfaction of someone who liked when things moved in the right direction. He was awake and breathing on his own, oxygen supplemented by nasal cannula, with the specific focused alertness of someone who had come back from somewhere and was still taking stock of the return. When she came into his bay, he looked at her immediately. He had been waiting, she realized. In the limited way an ICU patient could wait, without the ability to do anything about it, he had been oriented toward that door. "You're the one," he said. His voice was rough from the tube, the words slightly scraped, but the sentence was complete. "I'm Abigail Foster," she said. "I'm a nurse here." He looked at her with an attention that was different from a patient's usual attention to a nurse. Not because it was more grateful, exactly, but because it was more seeing. "Voss told me about you," he said. "He told me before they took me to surgery. He didn't know if he'd get to tell me later." He paused. "He said you were the best combat medic he'd ever deployed with." She looked at the monitor, looked at his lines, checked the things she was there to check. "How's your breathing feel?" "Like someone put a tube down my throat." A pause. "And like I'm not dead, which feels pretty good given the alternative." He watched her hands moving over the equipment. "Why are you a nurse here?" "It's where I work." "That's not what I asked." She stopped, looked at him directly. Dominic Reyes was 28 years old, she knew now from his chart, and he had the particular quality of young soldiers who had done enough hard things to have lost the edges of boyishness without yet acquiring the settled heaviness of the men above them in rank. He was looking at her with an openness that was not naive. He'd earned the right to be direct. "I needed somewhere quieter for a while," she said. "Did you find it?" She thought about the last 30 hours. "No," she said. He almost smiled. It pulled at the tape on his jaw. "Voss is going to try to recruit you back," he said. "He's already working on it. I can tell because he gets this look." "I'm aware." "What are you going to say?" She didn't have an answer to that, and he seemed to understand that because he didn't push it. He settled back against the pillow with the careful movement of someone whose torso was reminding him of recent events. His eyes stayed open. He was not going back to sleep. She could see that. He was doing the specific work of being conscious after a near thing, the deliberate processing of continued existence. She finished her check. "You need anything?" "Ice chips," he said. "And thank you, for what it's worth from someone who was mostly unconscious for it." "It's worth something," she said, and meant it. She got him the ice chips on her way out. The evening shift was coming in by the time she finished her charting. The audit team was still in the records room. She could see the light under the door as she passed. The waiting area had thinned. Patient advocates had taken contact information and scheduled follow-up appointments with families, which was the correct institutional response, and which had happened faster than she would have predicted. Someone, somewhere in this building, had made a decision to move quickly rather than cautiously, and she suspected that decision had a name attached to it that started with Ewan. She was packing up her bag at the nurse's station when Paxton came down the corridor looking for her. He was alone, which was a change from the morning. He had the specific look of someone who had spent a day discovering how large a thing was that he'd initially seen only one face of, and who was still recalibrating. "Ms. Foster," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" "Yes." They stood at the far end of the corridor away from the desk, in the particular informal geography of a conversation that was real rather than performed. Paxton was not a bad man, she had decided. He was a man who had trusted his systems and had not checked his systems. And the difference between that and negligence was one she was still working out the precise dimensions of. "The audit team's preliminary assessment is going to be significant," he said. "I don't have their final report, but I've been briefed on their initial findings, and there are cases going back 3 years that they want to look at closely." He paused. "Clariteo, the nurse Winslow filed against in September. She's been contacted. She wants to speak with the investigators." Another pause. "She's not the only former staff member." Abigail said nothing. "I want to understand," Paxton said, "how long you had been documenting before last night." "From my 3rd week," she said. He absorbed that. "Why didn't you bring it forward earlier?" It was the question she'd expected and the one she'd thought about most honestly. "I was probationary," she said. "I didn't have standing, and the documentation wasn't complete. I wanted to make sure that what I was seeing was a pattern and not a series of incidents that could each be explained individually." She paused. "I also—" She stopped, decided to finish it. "I wasn't sure anyone would listen." Paxton looked at her for a moment with an expression that had the quality of a man examining his own institution from a distance he hadn't previously been standing at. "We should have listened earlier," he said. "That's on me as much as anyone." It was the closest thing to accountability she'd heard from an administrator since she'd walked through this building's doors. She took it at face value, because that was what it deserved. "What happens to Winslow?" she said. "That's in the hands of the review board now. The medical board will have a separate proceeding." He paused. "I can tell you that his clinical privileges have been suspended pending outcome, meaning he can't practice here, and any other facility will receive notification that he's under review. That's standard process." "And the families?" "Patient advocacy has opened files on every case brought in today. The hospital's legal office is—" He stopped, seemed to choose the honest version. "It's going to be a long process, but we're not contesting the review. We're participating in it." She nodded. "Ms. Foster," he said, "I want to formally apologize to you for what happened in this department during your time here. I want to say it directly rather than leaving it implied." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. The same neutrality she'd offered him this morning, but meaning something different now, like not managing the moment, but acknowledging it. She went home at 7:30 p.m. The drive was quieter than the previous night, or maybe she was quieter. She couldn't tell the difference. The mountains were doing the thing they did at evening, the light going gold and then amber and then the blue-purple that came just before dark, and she drove through it without thinking much about anything specific. She ate dinner, this time something she actually tasted, sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open but not looking at it. The formal complaint was filed. The documentation was with people who knew what to do with it. The process was in motion in the way that processes were, which was slow and institutional and imperfect, and also, in this case, real. Her phone buzzed. Voss. She picked up. Reyes asked me to call you, he said. He wanted me to tell you, I'm quoting here, that he's going to eat solid food tomorrow, and he blames you personally. She felt something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Tell him I expect a full recovery. I will. A pause. How are you? Tired? Fair? Another pause. The specific quality of a conversation between two people who had a history that was also a weight, who were navigating around that weight without pretending it wasn't there. Marcia's office confirmed tomorrow, 1000 hours. I'll be there. I know. Abigail. He said her name the way he had in the bay, with the weight of it. Whatever you decide about what comes next, you should know that what you did here, in this building, these 11 weeks, it was the same as what you did over there. You just did it without anyone knowing your name. She didn't have a response for that either. It was the kind of thing that was true and large enough that responding to it felt like minimizing it. I'll see you tomorrow, sir, she said. She ended the call, sat for a while. Then she opened her laptop and found the email Ewan had sent, the one confirming the interim coordinator role, with the start date listed as pending her acceptance, with a note at the bottom in Ewan's direct, undecorated style. Your answer by morning, as discussed. Whatever you decide, the review proceeds and your position here is secure. But I think you know what the right next step is. Abigail read it twice. Then she opened a new reply, typed 2 sentences, and hovered over the send button for 3 seconds before pressing it. The reply sent at 8:14 p.m. At 8:47 p.m., her phone rang again. Unknown number. Different area code from the one Hosta had called from. She recognized the Colorado Springs exchange, but not the specific digits. She picked up. Ms. Foster. A woman's voice, clipped, institutional, in a specific way that was different from Hosta's, younger, or maybe just more pressured. My name is Investigator Nora Swick. I'm with the Colorado Medical Board's Professional Standards Division. I was assigned this afternoon to the Winslow case. A brief pause. I need to inform you that Dr. Winslow has retained legal counsel, and his counsel filed an emergency motion this evening to suppress your documentation as evidence in the review proceedings, on the grounds that it was compiled without supervisory authorization and may constitute a violation of your employment terms. Abigail went still. The motion is procedurally weak, Swick continued, and I don't expect it to succeed, but it creates a delay window. His counsel has also formally contacted Paxton's office with a letter alleging that the hospital's decision to remove Winslow was influenced by improper pressure from military officials, and that your documentation was, their phrase, coordinated retaliation for a legitimate disciplinary action. She let that sit for a moment. That's not accurate. I know that, Swick said. I've read your documentation. The timestamps alone make the retaliation argument untenable. You started the log in week 3, which is 8 weeks before last night's incident. Another pause. But Ms. Foster, there's a secondary element. Winslow's counsel has been talking to someone inside the hospital, someone who has provided a statement suggesting that you discussed the documentation with a colleague prior to the incident with Sergeant Reyes in a way that could be framed as coordinated. Abigail went through the people she'd talked to. Marcus. Dana. Nobody else had known about the log. She had not shown it to anyone, not mentioned its existence, not discussed it with Marcus directly. She had said nothing to Marcus that was anything other than observational, never framing it as a plan or a strategy, never asking him for anything except what the work itself required. Who provided the statement? She said. A brief silence. The statement was filed anonymously, Swick said, which limits what I can tell you. But I want you to be aware of it because it's going to come up in the proceedings, and because, she paused, because whoever provided it had specific details about your log that suggest they had either seen it or been told about it in enough specificity to describe its contents. The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail thought about the people who knew. She thought about Dana. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Major Host, who had received the document last night, and who she trusted in the limited way she trusted anyone in an institution she'd known for less than 48 hours. She thought about Paxton's assistant, who had been in and out of meetings all day with information flowing through her in multiple directions. And then she thought about something that she had not thought about until this exact moment. The fact that she had sent the log to Hosta's email at 10:23 p.m. and that the email had gone through the hospital's server because she had sent it from her hospital-issued laptop, and that the hospital's server was administered by a facilities team, and that facilities teams had administrators who had access to outgoing communications, and that she had never once considered that sending that document from her work machine was anything other than routine. She had documented everything carefully for 11 weeks. She had sent it from the wrong account. "Ms. Foster," Swick said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," she said. "I need to make a call." She ended it and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, running through what she knew versus what she didn't know, the shape of the gap between those two things, and what was likely sitting inside it. Then she called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been waiting. "Did you tell anyone about the log?" she said. No preamble. She trusted him enough to not need it. A silence that told her something before the words did. Not guilt, but recognition. The silence of someone who had just understood something. "No," he said. "I didn't know about the log, Abigail. You never told me about it specifically." A pause. "But I might have. I told Dana that I thought you'd been documenting, not what it contained, just that you were the kind of person who would." "When?" "This morning, before the meeting." His voice had the quality of someone doing the calculation at the same time she was. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Dana, who had been the one to tell Marcus that Winslow was seeking her termination. Dana, who had warned her to be careful. Dana, who had also, she remembered it now, clear as a snapshot, been the one to mention that Winslow had contacted Paxton at 8:47 p.m., which was specific. The kind of specific that came from proximity to the information, not from hallway gossip. Dana, who had been in this department for 15 years and whose position depended on a structure that Abigail's documentation had just dismantled. She did not say any of this to Marcus. Not yet. Because she was not sure, and certainty mattered, and she was too tired to trust her own thinking without running it through the test of sleep and morning. "It's okay," she said to Marcus. "Go to bed." She put the phone down, sat in the quiet for a long time. The log was already filed. The statement was already with the investigators. The anonymous statement, whatever it claimed, was going to run up against the timestamps that Swick had correctly identified as its primary weakness. That was solid ground. But Dana had been on that floor for 15 years. She had contacts, institutional knowledge, the particular information that came from being in a department long enough to know where everything was kept. And if she had looked at what was coming, the audit, the exposure, the reorganization, and decided that her best protection was a preemptive move against the person who had started it. Abigail's phone lit up. A text. Dana's number. 3 words. "We need to talk." She stared at Dana's text for a long time without responding, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was deciding something. Deciding whether the version of events she'd assembled in the last 10 minutes was the right one, or whether she was doing what tired people did after a long day of hard things, which was find the nearest available shape and pour their suspicion into it. Dana had been in this department 15 years. Dana had warned her to be careful. Dana had passed her Winslow's exact language about her not being clinically engaging enough. People who were working against you didn't usually hand you ammunition. She typed back, "Tomorrow morning, before shift." The phone sat quiet after that. She went to bed and slept better than she deserved to, which was the body's particular mercy after 2 days that had asked more of it than she'd planned to give. She arrived at the hospital at 6:15 a.m. Donna was already there, sitting in the small conference room off the main corridor with 2 cups of coffee on the table and the expression of someone who had also not slept well and was not going to pretend otherwise. Abigail sat down, did not take the coffee immediately. "Talk," she said. Dana wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I know about the anonymous statement," she said. "I didn't file it. I want to be clear about that first." "Then who did?" "Winslow's administrative coordinator, a woman named Peg Sutton. She's been with him for 11 years. Dana looked at the table, then back up. "Peg overheard me talking to Marcus yesterday morning. She was in the break room. I didn't see her. I mentioned that I thought you'd been keeping records, that you were the kind of person who documented things carefully. She paused. She put the rest together and took it to Winslow's lawyer before the end of the day. Abigail said, "Did you know she heard you?" "Not until last night. She called me." Dana's voice was flat in the way voices went flat when the person was angry and had decided to keep it contained. "She thought I'd be... I don't know what she thought. That I'd be glad, maybe. That I'd see it as protecting the department." A pause. "I told her she'd made a mistake and hung up." Abigail sat with that for a moment. The shape of it resolved. Not cleanly, not with the satisfying click of a perfect answer, but well enough to see the actual picture rather than the one she'd been afraid of. Peg Sutton. 11 years. The specific loyalty of someone whose professional identity was knotted to another person's authority, who had watched that authority come apart in 48 hours and had reached for the only lever she could find. "I need to tell Swick," Abigail said. "I know." Dana looked at her steadily. "I'll give a statement. I'll confirm what Peg told me, and I'll confirm that I didn't know about your documentation in any specific way, only that Marcus told me you were thorough." She paused. "I should have been more careful about what I said and where I said it. That's on me." It was a real acknowledgement, not defensive, not performed, the kind that cost something. "Okay," Abigail said. She took the coffee. They sat in the quiet of the small room for a moment that was not comfortable exactly, but was something more honest than comfortable. Two people in the same building who had been on adjacent tracks for 11 weeks without ever quite occupying the same space. Dana said, "I knew he was difficult. I told myself that difficult was manageable." She said it like she'd been working up to it. "I told myself that the department functioned and the patients were mostly fine, and that difficult supervisors were part of the job." She stopped. "Patrick Kimball was my discharge intake that day. I walked him out to his father's car." Abigail didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. "I should have looked closer," Dana said. "A long time ago." "Yes," Abigail said, because it was true, and because Dana was not asking for absolution, and because the honest answer was the only one worth giving. She called Swick at 7:30 and gave her Peg Sutton's name. Swick said she would follow up, that the motion to suppress remained procedurally weak regardless, that the timestamps on Abigail's documentation made the retaliation argument essentially indefensible. Then she said something that Abigail filed away. "Dr. Winslow's counsel withdrew the motion at 6 o'clock this morning. I don't know if that's strategic or if someone advised him that it was making things worse. Either way, the review proceeds on schedule." The review proceedings moved the way institutional processes moved. Not fast, not slow, but with the specific gravity of something that had achieved its own momentum. Over the following 3 weeks, the Colorado Medical Board's investigation expanded to include 14 cases spanning 4 years. The audit team identified a pattern of documentation gaps, premature discharge decisions, and at least 6 instances where a flag from nursing staff had been overridden without formal justification and without the override being recorded. Abigail was interviewed twice, once by the medical board and once by the hospital's internal review panel, which Ewan chaired with the same unadorned efficiency she brought to everything. Both interviews were recorded. Both times, Abigail answered every question with the same factual specificity she'd brought to her log. No editorializing, no personal grievance, just the documented record of what had happened and when, verified against patient charts that said the same thing. Clara Teo came back to Ashford for her interview and stopped by the department beforehand. She was 29, a pediatric nurse who was now working at a hospital in Denver, and had, she told Abigail in the corridor outside the main ER, spent 6 months believing that she had done something wrong. "He filed the report before I could even respond to it," she said. "I thought there was something wrong with me, that I'd misjudged the situation." She looked at Abigail's badge. "It helps, knowing it wasn't just me." "It wasn't just you," Abigail said. "I know that now." Clara looked down the corridor, at the department that had made her doubt herself, that looked ordinary from the outside, that most people walk through without knowing what it had cost certain people to survive it. "What made you stay? After the way they treated you?" Abigail thought about it honestly. The honest answer was that she hadn't stayed because she was brave or because she was strategic or because she'd known how it would turn out. She'd stayed because the work was real and the patients were real, and because leaving felt, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, like confirming a verdict she hadn't agreed to. She had been treated like someone who didn't matter, and she had kept showing up, not because she was proving a point, but because the alternative was letting the treatment define her, and she was not willing to do that. The work needed doing, she said, which was simple and true and also the only version of the answer she fully trusted. Clara nodded, seemed to understand that it was more than it sounded like. The medical board's formal findings were released on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after Sergeant Reyes had been carried through Riverside Valley's ambulance bay. Abigail read them in Dr. Ewan's office, seated across the desk, with a copy in her hand and Ewan watching her with the quiet attention of someone who had read the document already and knew what was in it. Dr. Garrett Winslow's clinical privileges were suspended indefinitely across all Colorado medical facilities, pending a formal disciplinary hearing before the state medical board. The findings cited, specifically, a pattern of inadequate documentation, a documented failure to act on nursing staff clinical observations on multiple occasions, improper use of the hospital's incident reporting system as a personnel management tool, and conduct unbecoming a department chief. The language was formal and measured and covered 6 pages. The effect of it was that he could not practice in this state until the hearing concluded, and the hearing was not going to conclude in his favor. His attorney issued a statement contesting the findings. It was the kind of statement that gets issued when there is nothing else to do. Paxton released a public statement acknowledging the findings and committing the hospital to full cooperation with all ongoing investigations. The statement also included a paragraph about the hospital's patient advocacy program, which had been restructured over the preceding 5 weeks, and a commitment to an independent review of departmental management practices. It did not mention Abigail by name, which was appropriate, and it did not use the word sorry, which was less appropriate but was what it was. Yuen's statement was shorter and said more. It was addressed to the staff directly, not to the public, and it acknowledged that the department had failed certain members of its own team in ways that it had a responsibility to repair. It named Clara Teo. It named Abigail Foster. It said, in language that was plain enough to be unmistakable, that what had been done to them was wrong, and that the institution accepted that. Marcus read it at the nurses' station and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he said, "That's the first time I've seen an administrator actually say wrong without a but after it." "Don't get used to it," Abigail said, but she was not unmoved by it. She was human enough to be moved by it. The hardest conversation was the one she had with Paxton about Patrick Kimball, which happened the week after the findings were released, and which Paxton initiated rather than waiting for it to come to him. He brought the hospital's legal counsel, which was appropriate. He also brought something that legal counsel had probably not advised him to bring, which was a personal letter to the Kimball family that he'd written himself and that he asked Abigail to read before it was sent. The letter acknowledged the specific failure of Patrick Kimball's care, offered no excuses, and did not use the word unfortunate or regrettable, which were the words lawyers preferred because they implied no agency. It used the word wrong. Twice. She told him to send it. She did not know what would come of the Kimball family's case. That was a legal and medical process that would run its own course, slow and imperfect, as those processes always were. But the letter would go. The acknowledgement existed. Patrick Kimball would know that someone in this building had looked at what happened to him and called it by its right name. That was not enough. It was also not nothing. Fort Callum was a 40-minute drive north on a clear morning, which the morning of her meeting with Colonel Marsh was the mountains crisp and close, the sky the specific shade of high-altitude blue that looked painted from a distance. Voss met her in the parking lot, which he didn't need to do, and walked with her to the administrative building without filling the silence, which she appreciated. Marsh was a deliberate man who said what he meant without performing the weight of it, which she recognized as a style of competence she trusted. He had assembled a small group, his medical advisor team, a woman from JSOC's training division, Voss, and a civilian consultant whose background she gathered was in trauma system development. They spent 2 hours talking about what a realistic trauma readiness program for Fort Callum's designated civilian hospital would look like. Not what it looked like on paper, but what it would need to function under actual conditions. She told them what she'd seen at Riverside Valley and what she hadn't seen. She told them what the gaps were and why they existed and what it would take to close them. She did not perform certainty she didn't have, and when someone asked a question she didn't know the answer to, she said so, and that seemed to go over better than any answer she could have manufactured. At the end of the 2 hours, Marsh said, "We'd like to offer you a formal consultancy role, civilian contracted quarterly engagement, to help us develop trauma readiness standards for our designated facility partners in this region." He paused. "That's in addition to whatever role you're taking at Riverside Valley." She looked at Voss briefly. He was watching her with an expression he was keeping carefully neutral, which meant he cared about her answer and didn't want to influence it. "I'll need to see the terms," she said. "Fair," Marsh said. On the drive back, Voss said, "You're going to say yes." "Maybe." "You're going to say yes," he said again, without pushing it. He looked at the mountains. "For what it's worth, I think you figured out something here that most people don't. You came back from what happened in Kandahar, and you didn't try to be who you were before. You tried to be who you needed to be next." He paused. "That's harder than most people know." She didn't respond immediately. The road curved with the terrain, and the shadows of the pines moved across the windshield in regular intervals, and she let the quiet be what it was before she said, "I wasn't sure I was still capable of it, the work, after everything." She paused. "I needed to find out in a room small enough that if the answer was no, it wouldn't cost anyone else." "And?" She looked at the road ahead. The answer wasn't no. When Dominic Reyes was discharged from Riverside Valley on a bright Wednesday morning, 14 days after his arrival, which was faster than his surgical team had initially projected, and which Reyes himself had accelerated through the particular bloody-mindedness of a man who did not enjoy being horizontal. He walked out under his own power, which he had made clear was non-negotiable, and he walked slowly and without his usual gait, and he didn't pretend it wasn't an effort. Abigail was on shift. She saw him from the end of the main corridor, him and Voss and 2 other members of his unit moving toward the exit with the specific quality of people who had business elsewhere and were glad of it. He saw her. Stopped. His team kept a few steps distance with the instinctive discretion of soldiers who understood when something was not for them. "Dr. Foster," he said. "I'm not a doctor," she said. She'd told him this 3 times during his recovery. He'd used the title anyway, every time with a stubbornness she'd eventually stopped correcting. "You are to me," he said. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was weaker than it would be in 6 months. That was fine. 6 months was available to him, which was the point. "Don't end up back here," she said, "working on it." He looked at her for a moment with that direct quality he'd had from the first time he'd been conscious enough to look at anything. "Whatever you decide about what's next, you're going to be good at it. You're good at this." He said it simply, the way soldiers said things they meant but didn't have ceremony for. "Take care of yourself, Foster." "You too, Sergeant." He walked out into the Colorado morning, and she watched him go. The paperwork for her interim coordinator role went through that afternoon. The terms of the Fort Callum consultancy arrived in her email at 5 p.m., and she read them on her phone during a break, standing at the window of the second-floor corridor with the mountains doing their late afternoon thing in the distance. The terms were reasonable. The scope was specific. The work was real. She accepted both before her shift ended. The department was different now, and the way that things were different when the structure changed, but the people were still learning what the new structure felt like. It was not fixed. She knew enough about institutions to know that fixed was not a destination, but a direction, and that the direction required maintenance, required people who stayed awake to it. There would be other gaps. There would be other moments where something important was dismissed by someone who should have known better. That was the nature of systems built by humans, which were as imperfect as the humans building them. But there was a log. There was a process for the log to reach people who could act on it. There was a department chair who said wrong without a qualifying conjunction after it. And there was Rachel Wu, who was now 3 months into her rotation and who had developed the specific habit of staying 5 extra minutes after rounds to make sure her documentation was complete. a habit that Abigail had noticed and said nothing about, because some things didn't need naming to be real. She drove home on a Thursday evening with the windows down, which she didn't usually do because the mountain air at this time of year had a bite to it that she wasn't in the mood for. She did it anyway. The cold felt honest. She had thought, when she'd come to Ashford 11 weeks ago, that what she needed was to disappear into work small enough that nobody would see her, to rebuild the confidence that Kandahar had partially dismantled, quietly, without anyone watching, without the weight of her own history pressing on every decision. She had wanted to be anonymous because anonymity felt safe, felt like a hedge against the possibility that she was not, anymore, the person who could do the work she'd been trained to do. She understood now that this had been half right and half wrong, in the specific way that self-protective reasoning usually was. The anonymity had been real. She had needed it, had needed the 11 weeks of small work and quiet observation and building evidence that she was still capable before anyone looked at the evidence. But the disappearing had not worked, in the end. Not because she'd been found out, but because the work itself had refused to be small. The work had kept being what it actually was, consequential, human, requiring her full self. And she had kept rising to it, not because she was performing courage, but because when someone was dying in front of her, she didn't have the architecture for turning away. That was who she was. She had been afraid it had changed. It hadn't changed. What had changed was the wall she'd built around it. That had come down in a trauma bay on a Tuesday evening. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular way that walls came down when something real pressed against them. Not with a crash, but with a slow yielding, the mortar giving first, and then the bricks one by one, and then the space where the wall had been was just open air. She pulled into her driveway as the last of the light left the mountains, sat for a moment. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into Riverside Valley Medical Center 11 weeks ago, carrying a thermos and a history she'd folded small enough to carry without showing, determined to be invisible in a building full of people who were better at seeing than they were at looking. She thought about every shift she'd worked without being asked who she was, every patient she'd helped without being thanked for it, every gap she'd filled without being credited with the filling. She did not think, I should have fought harder earlier. She did not think, I wasted those weeks. She thought, I did what I could do, when I could do it, with what I had. And when it was time to do more, I did more. That was the thing about quiet strength. It was not the strength of people who didn't feel the weight. It was the strength of people who felt it completely and moved anyway. Not because they were exceptional, because the work needed doing and they were there and capable and they refused, in the end, to pretend otherwise. She got out of the car. The porch light came on automatically, the way it always did when she came home late, triggered by movement, doing its small mechanical job without being asked. She stood in its light for a moment before going inside, looking up at the sky. The mountains invisible now in the dark, but present, the way permanent things were present even when you couldn't see them. She had been overlooked. She had been dismissed. She had been handed a mop and told her work was the supply closet, and she had done the supply closet, and she had also done everything else, because that was what the situation required, and because she was not someone who did less than the situation required. She had been told, in 100 small ways over 11 weeks, that she did not matter in that building. She had mattered anyway. Not because anyone finally recognized it, because it had been true the whole time. That was the only version of the story she trusted, not the one where recognition arrived and made her whole, but the one where she had already been whole and had simply waited for the room to catch up. She went inside, made tea, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house with the mountains somewhere behind the dark and the rest of her life somewhere ahead of it, and for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of what came next. She was ready for it.